Hi, I'm Clara Milliken and welcome to Art This Week. In this week's episode, we continue our series based on Texas-New York connections. Here we visit the incredible studio of Greenwich Village-based artist Mary Beth Edelson. Edelson recently had a show at the McKinney Avenue Contemporary in late 2010 titled, "There's Never Only One Game in Town." In Texas, she's represented by Deborah Colton Gallery. In this, our first of 2 episodes with her, we speak about her past work. Now for Art This Week.
So I'd like to ask you what you've been working on since our exhibition at the MAC in 2010.
Oh, I've been a very busy girl. Right after the exhibition at MAC, I went to Illinois to do the largest workshop performance that I've ever done, engaging 20,000 students at the University of Illinois in Carbondale. And what we did was a performance that's called, the title of it was Making Eye Contact. And this is a theme that I have been working on for about 20 some years. And I have sort of grown with it, and it's grown with me as far as how to deal with it. And I have discovered, well, from the very beginning, that it's a very political thing that I'm interested in relationship to making eye contact. Because making eye contact with a person says so much. Either you don't make it, you're rejecting them, or who do you make eye contact with? And I began noticing on the streets of Soho when I first moved here, and it was an article that I read in the paper that made me think of this, but that white people don't make eye contact with black people at that time. This was like in the 70s. And I felt that it made people who were not having eye contact made to them, made them feel like they were invisible. So I began making a concerted effort at that time to make eye contact with people on the street, especially those people that I think were not being looked at. And from that, many different projects have grown. And the one that I did in Illinois right after I was at the MAC invited the students on the campus to make eye contact with people they don't usually make eye contact with. And it was an hour long during the noon hour. We had music that was especially designed for this, played from the bell tower, and they never used the bell tower in that way, so that was exciting for everybody. And it was also then a collaboration between the music department and the art department. And I had a group of students that I worked with as the workshop to put this project in place, and they went out and talked to the students around campus about the project, explained what we were doing, and we filmed it, and it worked beautifully. I mean, it was just inspiring to see people get as emotional as they got about making eye contact and then speaking with people they didn't usually feel they had access to. So everybody was going out of their way to cross the boundaries that are set up that we don't think about. You know, we just go along looking for our friends and hanging out with the people we already know and not thinking about all these other groups that are around us. At that time, when I first started thinking about this, you would go into a college cafeteria, you would see a table of all black kids, all Asian kids, all white kids, all kids from one fraternity or whatever, but they were all broken up and they weren't making any contact with each other. So that was what this particular workshop and performance was addressing, was this. Some of the students, having made contact with people that they didn't normally make contact with, actually had tears coming down their eyes. Wow. There were others that came up to me afterwards and said, one Asian girl who was on campus, not a Native American, who said, I didn't know you could do this. I didn't know you could make eye contact. From her point of view, it was like you were not supposed to do that. So this was eye-opening for her to do it and then realize that she could continue doing it. So that project has had many different forms, and one of them was at the MAC, the performance that I did there, which was asking people to have sustained eye contact as long as it was comfortable to sit next to each other and just look into each other's eyes and not do anything other than that. A closeness comes, if that works, if it works that they can do that, a closeness comes that is not like a verbal communication. So that was one way that at the MAC tied in with many other projects that I've done, and then we took some very good photographs of people making eye contact there, and then that led on to the performance in Illinois.
I'd like to ask you, what is your background artistically and personally?
Well, I grew up in Indiana, in East Chicago, Indiana, on the harbor side. Now that was the rough side of the city. Okay. Yeah. It was a steel mill town. It was a town that people came to when they were immigrating to the country because they could get a good paying job. They could get a job and they could get a good paying job. And often they could find other people that spoke their language or churches that were the kind of churches they were used to going to because it was such a magnet for immigrants. As a WASP, this was an extremely different experience to have. And so I was really grateful that this was the way I grew up, even if it was a rough place, because it certainly prepared me for the way the world is now. And I know so many people who grew up without that kind of interaction with other people, continually having that interaction as they grew up, that are uncomfortable unless they're with people that are like them. And that has never been a problem for me because of this background.
Could you speak a little bit about your work in the 60s and 70s and your activist, with the feminists?
For me, it started in the late 60s, and I was still I was in Indianapolis, Indiana at that time, and in a situation that just infuriated me, which was that I started an organization called, what do we call ourselves, professional artists in Indiana. And I did all the work, I started it, but when it came to who should get credit for it, I was taken aside and told, if you really want this project to be taken seriously, you've got to have a man take the credit for this and have a man be the spokesperson. And I really didn't have any choice but to say, okay. I found myself speaking, this was very shortly before I left Indiana, speaking to the museum group and telling them this story. And I just became furious when I was talking, and I just let it all out. I just started talking about, do you realize what you're doing to women artists? It was like, 40 years or however old I was at that time. Pent up anger coming out of these people. I was sitting there like, there was no turning back from that. Once you let it out, it's out there. Yeah. I got away from there, and then I lived in Washington, D.C. for a while, and I tried when I was in Washington to figure out how I could get back to New York, because I did my master's degree at NYU, and then somehow ended up back in Indiana and blah, blah, blah. And then I just wanted to get back to New York.
Yeah. I know your famous work collected by the MoMA, Some Living American Women Artists / Last Supper. I was wondering if you could speak just a touch on that piece.
That piece, of course, has been very important for me. When I was still living in Washington, D.C., I was active with a Jungian group, and we met, I think it was once every other week for about 5 years, and we researched various aspects of Jung. And the reason I was invited to be part of this group is one of the founders of the group saw Jungian symbolism in the paintings I was doing at that time that I was totally unaware of. This was just intuitive work that was coming out. So I was invited to be part of that group, and I began then to learn more about Jung and the collective unconscious and various aspects that I found fascinating about Jung's background and what his teaching and his method of his psychological method, how he dealt with people's psychology. So that began to filter into my art making, and I decided I wanted to do a piece, and I ended up calling this piece 22 Others, in which I asked other people, that sometimes they were artists, sometimes curators, sometimes just other people in the art world, to look at my work and then to suggest a piece of work they would like to see me do as a result of it. In other words, not my own, not what I was already doing. In part, I was doing this because I had been a painter all my life and I wanted to stop painting. I had decided someplace along the line the painting was a bad habit, and that it was time to get away from it. And I thought if I asked people to come to the studio, look at the work, give me a suggestion, that would force me to honor the commitment I was making to them. And so I wouldn't fall back into this bad habit of painting. Many different wonderful suggestions came from that. And one of them came from a man named Ed McGowan, who's an artist. And he said, think about organized religion and think about what you feel is the most negative aspect of organized religion. And then make an artwork based on that. It was a great suggestion. And so I started thinking about it, and of course the first thing that came to my mind was the way they cut women out of, the way they subjugate women in organized religion, the way women are cut out of everything. And so I began to try to figure out how I could visualize that. So thinking of the iconic image of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, I thought if I took all the male heads out of that supper and put female heads in, female artists' heads in, that would be a good statement for saying, okay, how does this feel when you look at it? Yeah. How do you feel when you get cut out?
Yeah.
That initially people didn't get the political ramifications of that piece. They didn't see it as an absolute bomb in the sense of something going off, and it was censored so many times. Initially people just saw it and they saw the humor in it. They wouldn't see it and they would look at it and they'd laugh. They also were very interested in what women I selected to have what part. And I was still in DC, which is a good thing that I wasn't in New York, because it would have been difficult for me to have been non-political in what I selected for positioning people. I literally didn't know what the positions of the women were, so I just put in artists that I'd heard of and had some kinds of background, and that any woman who sent me a photograph got on the poster. So it's good that it ended up that way, because it was so egalitarian. It was everybody's welcome. Then I showed the poster a number of times. I made I call it a poster. It's actually a collage work, but I made a poster of it immediately, and sold the poster for $10 a piece. And people bought it because it was fun. And then time went by, and this more religious conservative aspect that began in the South and kind of filtered around the country began to look at it when they saw it displayed and insisted it be taken down, that it was an insult to them. And I got comments like, this is as bad as putting a cow's head or a pig's head on Jesus' head. So they were, in effect, referring to women as pigs or cows. And especially at one university that was shown a man who was head of, he was head of a department, but he also was a Orthodox priest, and he insisted that it be taken down from the Women's Studies Center. And you know, so a really huge debate and a lot of press, not only on that campus, but it became nationally covered. And that was interesting because it became a lively dialogue about what is this really saying? And a lot of people, very thoughtful people, wrote about it at that time and were able to peel back the layers of, okay, what is really being said here, and why people respond in such a violent way to this image. And so it became the image that I was most associated with, because as the years went by, it didn't cool off. As far, you know, usually artwork is fashionable and then it cools off and something else happens. But this just continued having a life of its own in various venues and various dialogues. When Connie Butler of the Museum of Modern Art put together the exhibition called WAC, which was a fantastic survey of mostly feminist artists, 120 artists, I think, altogether, and traveled to major venues in the country. She put that poster in the exhibition. Now, that poster is not the only one that I did at the time. I did 5 posters in which, or 5 collages in which I removed the male head and put female heads in it. So she put all 5 of those original collages in that exhibition, and then she decided, came back to me in the studio and decided the Museum of Modern Art wanted to buy all of them. And first I thought she meant they just wanted to buy some living American women artists, and I said, oh, I'm just so thrilled, yes, that's wonderful. And then I said something about the other, you know, the others, and she said, oh, you mean I can't have all of them?
Well, yeah, you can.
Oh, you want them all? Yes, of course, of course.
So I'd like to kind of change gears here and talk to you about what you are working on now artistically and with the workshops with the students.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk about the workshops first, and then maybe we can move into your studio and we can look at some work that you're working on now.
Yeah. Starting, you know, with the feminist movement was a workshop. Period. And I was very engaged with that. And when we got together, we decided what we were doing. We were a workshop, and we were many workshops on the East and West Coast, around the country. From that kind of basic community work and working together and realizing how much you learned from each other when you were working in a workshop, I began putting together workshops that I then offered to various universities, that I would come and do workshops with the students who were interested in signing up for those workshops. They were usually around something specific, like doing a workshop for the purpose of presenting a performance. So in the workshop we would decide collectively, okay, what do we want to do? What do we want to present at this time? What's on our mind? How are we going to visualize that? What are the props going to be? And then rehearsing that and presenting it. And that I did in many different universities. And each university had each of the workshops had a different theme. If we look at the images, this one is from Iowa, And when I went out to Iowa, I'd already done quite a few workshops by that time. They have a space called the Corroboree, and Hans Brader headed that, and Anna Mangetta was still at school in Iowa at that time, and it was Anna that put me in contact with Hans Brader because he was her lover. She was still a student at that time, but he was her lover. And Lucille Lepard had put me in touch with Anna because she felt there were crossovers in our work and that we would have we should talk to each other and get to know each other. So that's how I got invited out to Iowa. I thought about what is in Iowa and what we might want to do there. So we did a performance and this performance was very much based on my relationship with Anna. I felt very motherly toward her. She's 15 years younger than I am, and I guess the fact that she's short also it seemed like a daughter. The first part of the performance was a mother-daughter exchange in which the mother nurtured the daughter, and then it switched around and the daughter nurtured the mother. I used fire a great deal. This is in the Corroboree, which is an open stage with a number of steps in it. It's a perfect place to do performances. And I was trying to leave the camera lens open to get the sense and feeling of this performance, because a performance is very hard to document if you're not making film of it. If it's a still image, it's hard to capture the essence of what's going on, the sort of the spirit of what's in the air. So I was trying to do things like this, like leaving the lens open a long time, and it would give you some other kind of sort of spiritual implication in the thing, because after all, what we were doing, we were being extremely generous and in the exchanges that we were doing with each other at the time. After we finished doing this, we took off these robes that we had on, and we marched out to a cornfield. Now, during the day, we went out into this was at the end of the season, so they cut down the corn stalks, and a lot of them were just cut down and on the ground. So we gathered them up in big bundles, bundled them together with twine, and made 3 long rows about 300 feet long. And then we had 3 groups of people on each of the rows, and we entwined our bodies we had the cornstalk robes on our shoulders, and then we braided our bodies back and forth so that we had one long cornstalk that had been braided together. And then we took that cornstalk and we hoisted it on our shoulders, and then put it on a hillside, a sloping hillside, in the shape of a spiral. And then at sunset, we lit the corn stalks, and they burnt in the spiral shape. And then after that, this whole day was a performance.
Yeah.
And you can do that with students because they're not going off to work. So after we were finished sitting, people would get into the middle of this fire ring and fire spiral and sit there as the fire burned around them. It looked like they were literally being burned, but they weren't. Obviously they weren't. But then we went back to the Corroboree, and we as a group performed some of the mother-daughter nurturing, but everybody who had been at the performance got together and did that, and then that was the end of it. So it was an attempt to give people a rather uplifting experience all day long. We had perfect weather that day. If we didn't have perfect weather, it would never been quite the same. But we did the performance in the Corroboree, and then lighting the fire and sitting in the fire, and then coming back to the Corroboree, and then everybody exchanging what we, repeating, but everybody, both the performers and the audience coming together. So that was a very nice piece, and it became this kind of workshop that just really expands. Going back to the performance that I talked about that was in Illinois at Carbondale, that's a teacher's school. And those children, those students were then going to go out and be teachers. And I had taught them something that they are going to definitely take out and use in their classrooms. It's a way of breaking down groups of people who don't want to communicate with other people, and how you might do that in your community. And we talked about what other configurations could this take. And in that particular community, they said, well, we have a railroad that runs through this town, and one side of the railroad is for mostly the black Hispanic people, and the white people on the other side. And one of the students said, what we should do is line up along that railroad with each group on both sides and make eye contact and stay there for a while, and then just reverse sides. So he began thinking, okay, this is how I could use this idea and take it out.
That's awesome, yeah.
Out into the world.
We want to thank Mary Beth for speaking with us. More information on her can be found at marybethEdelson.com. In Houston, she is represented by Deborah Colton Gallery at deborahcoltongallery.com. In New York, she is represented by Acola Griffin Gallery, and they can be found at acolagriffin.com. We want to thank the McKinney Avenue Contemporary for setting up this studio visit. More information on them and the exhibition she had there, go to the-mac.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I'm LauraLee Brott here with Mary Beth Edelson in her studio today in New York City in Soho.
Sorry.
That's okay, because I fumbled anyway, so that works out.